All right, we're talking in this lecture about the Russian Revolution. And we're talking about the time period in Russia from about the 1900s to about the time of World War II. It's a little wishy-washy with kind of our dates here, but we're going to get from the towards the end of World War One up to the 1930s. So the first thing we want to talk about are the effects of Russian industrialization. And we hit on this is that the leaders of Russia wanted to industrialize and bring Russia into the 20th century. However, the industrialization led to further gain for the workers, which are calling for more rights, which the higher ups in the government don't want them to do. And so the same things that we see with industrialization in all of the industrialized countries, Britain, United States, Germany, and France, there's going to be the same thing happening in Russia, where there's going to be discontent stirred amongst the people of Russia with, again, poor working conditions, low wages, child labor, all the stuff that we've been talking about on the last couple of chapters here. Only in Russia that's a little bit different, to where even though in all those other countries as well, workers look to Marxist revolutionaries following the ideas of Karl Marx and his brand of communism, the Russians really are going to take it to the next level. So one group of Russian Marxist people advocating for a communist revolt are called the Bolsheviks. They are led by a guy named Vladimir Lenin, who we'll talk about more later. Lennon, in one of the series of things that he's good at, is very good at branding. And so he makes the choice of calling the Bolsheviks, which means majority in Russian. And so this small group, they're not ever really that big until they finally get power with the collapse of the Russian government. It seems though, if you read about them, that it's the majority is there. And what the Bolsheviks with Lenin advocate for is immediate workers' revolt. They want to bring about Karl Marx's over of the workers overthrowing the capitalists and then kind of bringing everything in a communal nature from there. They're led by Vladimir Lenin, and he is again one of these great charismatic figures of world history. He's very engaging. He's extraordinarily ruthless. And what makes him so successful is that he's an excellent organizer. Right? He's able to pick the people to be successful, delegate tasks for them, and be able to keep this whole organization going, particularly in times before he even really gets anywhere, when they're just building this up. The other group of Marxist revolutionaries in pre-World War One Russia are called the Mensheviks. And they kind of are forced to take that name because the majority is taken, so they get coined the Mensheviks, which means minority. They're much more moderate. They're still advocating for, again, a workers' revolt and other things along that nature with communism, but a little bit more moderate, a little bit more willing to wait, a little bit more willing to kind of go from there. And so they're a little bit more moderate in terms of their overall political views. What we see with Russia over the course of the 20th century is crises at home and abroad. We see a loss in the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 that sparked unrest and revolt to the point where peasants stormed the Winter Palace of the Tsar on January 22nd, 1905. And the only thing that keeps them from storming the palace itself is being machine gunned on what's deemed Bloody Sunday by the government in order to get them back. When the First World War breaks out, Russia and the Russians enter the war very enthusiastically. Only, as we saw through our World War One discussion, the Russians are repeatedly defeated by poor planning, poor strategy, and are just completely uh, outmatched on the battlefield. As the Russians move through 1914 and 1915, as we enter into 1916, the prospects on the Eastern Front for the Russians are going so poorly that the Tsar decides that the leader of Russia decides that he no longer can just sit back kind of in Moscow and St. Petersburg and let these losses continue. He says, I'm in charge. I'm the leader of Russia. And he goes and leaves the government and he goes to the front. It's then that his wife, Alexandria, um, kind of is quote unquote in charge. And so there's the Tsarina rules. Now, the Tsarina really isn't popular with the people as it is. And so by her being kind of quote unquote in charge for what it seems in all intents and purposes is that it just gives more reason for the people to hate. They start to blame her for all those different problems from there. At this point, that a rather mysterious figure enters into the kind of the Russian Revolution here is that as the Tsarina is now kind of in for in terms of public opinion running Russia, she begins to rely increasingly on the influence of a mysterious, mystical kind of Russian monk who kind of comes off the steppes of the vast eastern portions of the country with a very checkered and interesting backstory, and becomes more involved with her son. Her son, Alexei, is the heir to the Russian Empire and the heir to the throne. However, thanks to decades and centuries of inbreeding amongst the royal families of Europe. Alexei is born with a rare blood condition called hemophilia. Basically, he lacks the ability to make the protein that coagulates your blood when you get a bruise or a cut. And you just bleed and bleed and bleed and bleed and bleed. So this becomes extraordinarily scary for again the Tsarina, and the only person that seems to have any sort of help is Rasputin, and it's disputed even up to this day how his help kind of does that. But for whatever reason, it works, and he then becomes more and more ingratiated with the Tsarina, who thanks him for saving her youngest child and the heir to the Russian throne. And it kind of looks bad to outsiders as this kind of person with poor manners, with very outlandish behavior, very vulgar jokes to the Russian nobility, doesn't really kind of have the same charm on them that he does with the Tsarina. So this is we're kind of moving back and forth and covering a lot of territory here. This is the terms of Bloody Sunday, where the Russian army is forced to fire on crowds of Russians who are trying to storm the Winter Palace, 1905. They do get some concessions out of this, but not very much from there. While this is happening, Vladimir Lenin, there in the center of the frame, and again, this is pretty much here in 1904, 1905, all of the Bolsheviks that are in Russia. He's going to get himself kicked out of Russia by the government because, again, he's advocating treasonous things of overthrowing the Tsar and getting rid of him. So he's going to move off there. You can freeze and pause this on this picture. This kind of, again, a brief overview of what the timeline is on the Eastern Front. But again, for the most part, what we talked about, the Russians here, the reservists are happy in August of 1914 to sign up. They're more than happy to run off to war. And then what happens? They are defeated again and again and again, repeatedly. They're captured. They're forced to surrender. They're having to run away. And it's just defeat after defeat after defeat. And so discontent begins to run in there. This is the Tsar Nicholas. He is the in charge of Russia. That's his wife. They have four. Sorry, I'll be able to count one by five daughters, and then eventually, after all those daughters, they finally get Alexei, and so the Tsar leaves his family, all right, and he goes off to here in the front to go kind of take charge of this. If Russia, he's going to be kind of the last quote unquote absolute ruler of Russia, and so he's going to make sure that Russia wins against the Germans. Right? He's trying to protect the empire that he hopes to bequeath to his youngest child and son Alexei. And again, he has hemophilia, and so this is particularly scary. I mean, think about little kids who are always jumping and banging and stuff. I mean, I can probably look on my own body and find three or four different bruises where I don't even know how I got them. And again, but I don't have hemophilia, so I know those are going to heal. They won't for a hemophiliac. And so unless they're giving blood transfusions or be injections of the protein, they're just going to bleed and bleed and bleed and bleed and bleed. And so he has his own kind of bodyguards to kind of keep him safe as he's going through all this other stuff. But again, it's from there. And so the only person that's able to kind of help and stop any of these episodes is this man in the colorized and non-colorized picture here, Gregory Rasputin, who's able to kind of come off the steps and during these episodes of of great tension in the house, the Tsarina, particularly attached to her youngest child and youngest son, again, who's kind of confined to these places, he's the only one that's able to comfort not only the child, but also the Tsarina. And as the Tsar moves away from the palace, and the kind of the only male influence that kind of seems to the outside is Rasputin, as he kind of ingratiates himself not only with the royal family but also with other uppity ups in the Russian government. And so this kind of, again, spooky, mysterious figure that the Russian people don't like, the Russian nobility hates with a fiery passion. They don't really like that. And so what begins to happen is that, particularly, again, emphasizing the Russian nobles begin to feel and see that Rasputin has this kind of particularly um, re- interesting, and there's much speculation over what's the real nature of the monk with the Tsarina, particularly when the Tsar goes off to the front. It kind of seems that Rasputin has control over the Tsarina, he becomes the ruler of all of Russia. He's the one making the Tsar dance, and a lot of people start to get upset that this person becomes kind of in charge of, for what it seems to particularly peasants who are going to believe whatever they're kind of told from there. And so a group of Russian nobles takes it upon themselves to go and get rid of Rasputin, and they're going to murder him in this nice, finely decorated basement here. Now, the story of this is very much disputed, and it kind of goes back and it's retold by the person who does the murder 4 or 5 different times. But basically, after a night of partying, around 2 or 3 in the morning, Rasputin, with a small group of Russian colonels, is brought back to this basement, and there he is told to wait, and they're going to bring out some refreshments, and they bring out some like snack cakes, like cupcakes. And so they then give one of these to Rasputin. Now, what Rasputin doesn't know is that the Russian colonels have put cyanide inside of these cakes, and one of these cakes is he's supposed to pop in his mouth and he'll die, and that'll be the end of Rasputin. Only he starts eating one, and then two, and then three, and then four, and he's having a grand time, and the Russian colonels are just mouth agape, going, "What's happening? This should be killing a normal man." Right? The story goes is that Rasputin had been anticipating that he eventually might be poisoned, right, throughout his life, and so he'd be kind of built up an immunity to this by taking small amounts, minuscule amounts of cyanide, right, in order to build up a resistance to it. And there it goes. So then they the colonels who are looking at this person who should be dead turn to Rasputin and say, "Hey, would you like some wine?" And Rasputin says, "Oh, yes, I love some wine." So they bring him some wine with another type of poison in it. And he goes and has 1 glass, 2 glass, 3 glasses, and again, still no effect. And now the Russians are getting upset, and they're like, "Oh, this person should be dead. We're so frustrated out of it." The one colonel says, "I got this." Goes upstairs, grabs a pistol, comes down, and says, "Here you go," and gives him a bullet shot right to the chest. Rasputin groans, falls to the ground. That's the end. They congratulate themselves. They clap hands. They shake themselves off. They say, "All right, good." So they go outside to go kind of remove some of the evidence, make it look like Rasputin has gone back home. They need a rug to roll up his body. They come back home. They come and see Rasputin, who's there bleeding out of his chest. And they go, "All right, how are we going to do this?" When Rasputin pops back up, charges at the Russians, who are now freaked out, and bolts his way out into the streets, where it takes 2 more bullets, including one to his forehead, in order to finally bring him down. The colonels are so angry at Rasputin at this point that they just grab him and throw him off a bridge, right? And that's where early the next morning people find the monk with his feet tied and what appears to be his hands unbroken. Most likely, what happened in the cold Russian winter is that the ice in the water had caused these things to uh, um, come apart. But again, it gives the myth that Rasputin was still alive when he was thrown overboard, with poisoning from the cakes, with poisoning from the wine, with 3 bullets in his body, and he was still struggling. And again, very much disputed. That's about as good of as historical telling as we can say it. You're going to hear different ways from different people, but I mean, even the guy who's telling this story changes this story 3 or 4 different times, and the Russian autopsy is kind of contradicting even of itself. So we're doing the best we can as we finally pull Rasputin's body out of the water, and they can go and see how he goes and meets his grisly demise. So as we move through into 1917, we have what's called the February into March Revolution, where female textile workers begin to revolt in the city of Petrograd because they are unhappy with other stuff. And these revolts turn into 5 days of riots over shortages of bread, more importantly, fuel. Remember how cold it is in Russia during the wintertime. And if you have no coal, you have no lumber in order to heat your house, right, your kids are going to freeze to death before they can start complaining about how hungry they are. It's estimated that over 200,000 workers, and this is a key thing, this is a perfect moment in history where women are leading this, right, taking to the streets and calling for more food, better representation of the government, right, having the government kind of do things more for the home front, in along with, right, trying to win the war in the Eastern Front. These riots in Petrograd then begin to spread throughout the country in a general uprising. This general uprising reaches the Tsar, and he finally realizes that the people don't want me, and he abdicates from the throne. He steps down, and a new provisional government is then established, right, to then run Russia. This provisional government is led by Alexander Kerensky. Alexander Kerensky makes one of the great dumb decisions of world history and decides, I'm going to keep fighting this war. That the Russians are losing, and he should have just stopped and gone from there. At this point, the war is so kind of hated, and the Russian soldiers don't really even want it. They're facing huge amounts of mutinies and people leaving from the front. It's at this point back in Russia that Soviets begin to be established in localities throughout the nation. And a Soviet, it just means a local representative council that was formed in Russia. So these local, the local regular people begin to meet and begin to say, we're going to take control of our own local because this imperial government can't do anything. Kerensky does do other things to help try to stem the tide of the fleeing on the Eastern Front. The soldiers are given more control in the army, particularly in days off. This is a part of if you take a step back throughout all of the World War One, right around 1917, most of the soldiers in all the different combatants nations are asking for, hey, we want more time off. Hey, we can't do this. Hey, we need better strategies. So it's kind of part of a bigger wave. Uh, but we see it particularly in Russia, where the feelings are inflamed. Peasants begin to seize land from the nobles for themselves. It's at this point that we said the Germans unleashed the virus of communism by picking Vladimir Lenin up with spies in Switzerland and dropping him off in the Russian border. He very quickly arrives in Petrograd, and he and the communists begin making all sorts of promises. He's speaking to a very simple and literate Russian kind of peasantry, and he keeps his message very simple. What are the communists and Lenin going to do? They're going to give all power to the Soviets, and if you give over a kind of some rights, and if you support Lenin, what are you going to get? You're going to get peace. Lenin's going to end the war with Germany. You're going to get land. Again, going back to time immemorial, what do people want? They want a land of their own, be able to go and make their own little castle, whether it's a pit hut or a big giant house, and they want bread. Peace, land, and bread are what the communists and Lenin are going to promise. You're going to want to need to know that, hint, hint, hint. Um, and that's what they're doing. By November of 1917, the communists and Lenin have overthrown the provisional government. Lenin, now in charge, quote unquote, of Russia, signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which we talked about in the World War One PowerPoints. Again, that ends the war there, and where Russia is signing away a quarter of its territory. Lenin says that doesn't matter. What matters is taking control of Russia and then using Russia as a springboard to begin a worldwide workers' revolution. In July of 1918, the Tsar, who's been imprisoned by the communists since them taking over, the Lenin, as the country kind of descends towards a civil war, says he's a liability. People are going to try to get him, try to start a rival government. We can't have that. So he sends communists to go into the kind of fortified, quote unquote, like mock prison that they made for the Tsar, and they execute him and his little girls and family in a basement, and then dump their bodies down a mine shaft. And this is going to then kick off what ends up being called the Russian Civil War. Lenin and Trotsky are going to lead the communists, and that's going to go on them. On the other side of the Russian Civil War, you have what were called the White Russians. One side, we'll talk a little bit more about this in a little bit, but Lenin and Trotsky lead the communists, and what's termed the White Russians are made up of very different groups who are only really united in their hatred of communism. So it's pretty forever. The Russian Civil War is pretty brutal. We talked about all the millions of people who died in the First World War. Well, in the Russian Civil War, that's going to rage from about 1918 to about 1921, 22, 14 million Russians are going to die in this 3 year struggle. From 19, about 15 to about 1989, it's not going to be a real great time to be a Russian. So to recap, kind of pictorially here, what begins to happen in February of 1917, people begin to become upset with long lines to get food, shortages of bread, shortages of coal, unhappy with the industrial kind of workers' reforms. So what do? The women lead marches into the streets. 200,000 of them revolt and strike and demonstrate for over 5 days that begin to then be spread throughout the rest of the country. As they're doing that, the Tsar abdicates. Alexander Kerensky then takes over and makes the ill-fated decision of let's keep the war going, even though he does institute some changes that the peasants were calling for. However, the army begins to mutiny like these soldiers before. More and more soldiers begin to run home to protect their homes and their families and be able to go and, in some cases, help out the communists. The people back in the local areas of Russia begin to form Soviets, collective meetings where they're all trying to get together, saying that we can better run our local area rather than a big imperial government in St. Petersburg or Moscow can. The government tries to fight back. The provisional government will machine gun, as you can see, people in the streets here to try to regain some order, which then leads to the communists storming the Winter Palace in November of 1917 to try to seize control, take it over. This is a picture that's made a couple years after for a movie. But again, it shows a little bit of the scale of the people trying to go and do that. And this is all being orchestrated and led by Vladimir Lenin. Right, Lenin, one of the great public speakers in all of world history. Again, the ability to communicate his ideas quickly, effectively, and simply. Again, what do the communists want? You should have shouted in your room there: peace, land, and bread. And that's what the communists are going to keep saying over and over and over again. Meanwhile, the little the Tsar family has been captured and has been holed up in a room. So these little girls have grown to these teenage girls, and this family is now being held kind of under house arrest by the communists. They have a fence put around their window to protect um, themselves from the outside, the Russians who are pretty angry with them, and also be able to keep an eye on the royal family so they can't do anything. So they're under house arrest for 5 or 6 months. And these are pictures from the camera that they were taking while they were in there. And as you probably can imagine, particularly as we're listening to this in the end of March of 2020, they're starting to go stir crazy. And then as we move into July of 1918, as the communists say, we need to be able to not have any sort of rivals to power in Russia. They go and they execute the Tsar and the Tsarina. Then they go downstairs and they execute the rest of the family, including all those little girls that we just saw. This is the basement door where, again, they were lined up in machine gun. It's a little bit ripped apart as they were looking for bullets and other stuff that the family are having. But again, the girls are going to last a little bit longer when they're machine gunned because they had over a couple kilograms of diamonds and rubies and other stuff sewn into their garments to kind of hide them. And so those were some of the diamonds and gems that were inside the clothes of the girls when they're from there. And so what we begin to have take place is the Russian Bolshevik communists are now in control of Russia, right? With the leader under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, his right-hand man, Leo Trotsky, right, and another small little guy, Joseph Stalin, who's going to become more and more important as we move into the Russian Civil War here. Civil war is now raging in Russia, right? The civil war is going to be fought between those favoring the Tsar, right, who want to return to imperial rule or in turn to a rule that's anything but communism, and they're going to be known as the White Russians. And on the opposite side of the Russian Civil War are those going to be favoring communism, and they're going to be called the Reds. Think of the Soviet Union red flag, and red becomes really the symbol for communism, right, dating back again to Marx and Engels. The Civil War, it becomes kind of so out of hand that in 1919 and 1920, as again the Spanish flu is kind of swirling all around, and as all these people in Europe want to go back home, the Allied forces of World War I actually send troops and supplies into Russia to fight against the communists. The British send troops into and Navy sailors into Odessa. The Japanese land in the east, and the Americans land at Vladivostok and Archangel in order to be able to help out there. And the Soviets aren't going to forget this, and this is going to be something particularly in the back of Joseph Stalin's mind for a very, very, very long time that the Allies actually were trying to knock the communists out of power. Who wins the Russian Civil War? The communists do. What the communists do is, upon winning, they expel the aristocracy out of Russia. They give them a choice. They can stay and be shot in the head, or they can leave with the clothes on their back, and most choose to do that. Why did the communists win? They win for three major reasons. One, they are much more centrally located. When the Civil War starts, the communists have control of kind of Moscow in the center of Russia. So they have what are called the interior lines of kind of communication. They can move stuff all around from there. They're in the center, whereas all of the white Russians are, or the people supporting the white Russians are all kind of on the periphery. They're separated and they can't try to get in there. The communists are much better disciplined. They have that's very clearly what they're fighting for. They're fighting for communist rule and the ideas of what Lenin trying to do. They believe in Lenin, and they also have discipline in the ranks to where I mean they have uh, kind of the head communists who will shoot anybody who turns and runs away in the battle. They're much more united. Again, the only thing that unites the white Russians is their hatred of communists. And so, again, when you ask why with the white Russians, well, what government are you going to, what changes are you going to put in place? That's going to lead to a whole bunch of bickering and infighting from there. And that, again, is what the communists are able to use for their own advantage. Because the communists expelled the aristocracy from Russia, it wouldn't be uncommon in 1920s Paris to have your doorman at your kind of apartment place or at your kind of mansion, or your taxi driver being a former duke of Russia or a general from the Russian army, just because they had to get out of there and they're trying to make their own way. The communists win. By 1922, Lenin has reorganized Russia into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, and he's established Communist Party dictatorship over the rule as as Lenin tries to slowly move them to quote unquote true communism. In late 1922, Lennon's going to suffer a stroke, and a kind of infight, first of words and then of bullets, begins between his two kind of successors, Leo Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. And when Lenin finally dies from the stroke, and he's kind of a vegetable and he can't really communicate that well, when he finally dies, it's Joseph Stalin who, after a bit of jockeying and monkeying around, is going to go and take over the new Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin, or as Harry Truman in the 1940s calls him, Little Joe. He's only like 5'2". He's not that big. Here is this is one of his first mugshots from the turn of the century, as he comes from there. And again, he's going to be arrested several times before he finally kind of finds himself and ingratiates himself in the communists. What comes out of the Russian Civil War is just death and destruction. So there's some bodies, here's some more dead bodies, and if you're looking up, yep, here's even more dead bodies as they go through. The Russian aristocracy who escaped kind of got on any of the last boats and grabbed anything they could find to be able to try to escape the persecution once it became certain the communists were going to win. And the Allied soldiers, including Americans and Japanese, right, showed up to try to help from there. The Allies sent aid to help out the Russians during this point as well. You can see this is from Chicago, Illinois, this nice pure lard that's sent there. And then again, you have Americans going and fighting in Siberia and dying in Archangel and Vladivostok to try to help out the White Russians to overthrow the communists because Americans really hate communists. Leo Trotsky is kind of again one of the great leaders of the Bolsheviks and the communists, and is a little bit is much more moderate in his stance towards communism, towards the people than Stalin is. But he lacks Stalin's just straight up ruthlessness, and so through political maneuvering and some other stuff, Trotsky's going to be forced out. He's going to be kicked out of Russia. He's going to end up in New Jersey for a couple years, and then he's going to end up in Mexico in Mexico City trying to start a communist revolt there when Stalin, who's been tracking him and spying on this entire time, finally has an assassin put a bullet in the back of his head as he's sitting sipping coffee in a Mexico City cafe. So who then takes over? Lenin. Then it becomes closer and closer to his buddy Joseph Stalin when Lenin then suffers a stroke and becomes a kind of an invalid and unable to really kind of run it with the same strength and vigor. When he dies, Stalin is going to take over. So what does Stalin turn the Soviet Union into? He turns it into the first of what we'll see come out in the 1920s of a totalitarian government. Totalitarianism is a government that is total, centralized state control over, and this is in capital letters, every aspect of public and private life. The government is in complete total control of everything that you do. And the goal of a totalitarian government is have this total control, control over what you think, what you do, what you say, and how you act. They want to have all of that control over everything. So how do they accomplish this in the Soviet Union? First with police terror. Now dating back to Ivan the Terrible, the Russia has really been a police state where they're used to spying. There's used to kind of intimidating people and murdering people as well. It's not uncommon, particularly up through the 1950s, to have people in the middle of the night knock on your door, take away a family member, and put a bag over their head, and never see them ever again, and you never even hear about from there. One example of the terrorist state that was the Soviet Union is the 1937 Great Purge. Stalin, upset over the slow industrial growth and agricultural growth, and also what he perceives to be as enemies in his army, is going to kill 8 to 13 million people in of his own government he doesn't like, and he's going to kill them as enemies of Stalin. When we talk about again personalities of great leaders, Stalin is, we could say, without question, is one of the most paranoid people ever to be in charge of a major state or empire, and it's the great misfortune of the world that not only he does this, but the one person that he is going to trust is the most untrustworthy person you could possibly find in the 20th century is Adolf Hitler, but that's a story for another day. Totalitarian government of the Soviet Union also works with indoctrination, and this is where they take control over education. This begins very early with young children, and the Soviet Union controlled all education, everything that was taught from preschoolers in kind of pre-K all the way through elementary school, middle school, high school, all the way up through college, even to post-college degree, was all controlled and told by the state. You couldn't teach anything other than what the state told you to do, and to do that would be either at the least sent off to the gulags or at the worst murdered. They complete and total control over propaganda, putting forth a information that they controlled to kind of one boost the image of the Soviet Union and particularly the communist government, and also censoring some of the weaknesses and more importantly anything else that's happening that would kind of not conform to that. Soviet Union was not very tolerant of individual creativity that didn't conform to the views of the state, Communist Party, or Stalin. Now, we want to take a little bit of side jot here to kind of emphasize that it's not that there was no creativity in the Soviet Union. We see a lot of important movies, particularly come out of the 1920 Soviet Union that have large effects on cinema. But if that creativity didn't conform to the state or the Communist Party and Stalin, particularly as it gets more and more control and dictatorial and totalitarian in the 1930s and 1940s into the 50s. Anything else was kind of just kicked off straight to the Siberia. We also see religious persecution. This dates back to the ideas of communism itself, with Marx calling religion the opiate for the opioid for the masses. There, and so the government works to try to replace religious teachings with the ideals of communism. We are not worshiping a quote unquote God. We are just kind of saying, hey, everything I do is in function of the state so that everybody can kind of work communally together. And so we see, like in this picture, people who were against this or working against the communist state were rounded up and shipped off to the gulags, or they were just executed by firing squads. Um, the churches, some of these beautiful old Byzantine and Eastern Orthodox churches are destroyed and ransacked and left to rot as the religion has got away with them, and the peasantry of Russia is really not going to be happy about that. And then again, we see lots of propaganda kind of showing how great this stuff is. And we can see propaganda and censorship over how Stalin is able to tell the story himself. And you can see this particularly through pictures. That again, you can kind of trace the production of this control, where you have again pictures like this here on the left, taken in 1926, and then as Stalin gets angry with this guy and gets rid of him, and that guy and gets rid of him, and that guy gets rid of him. What does the story change? That instead of these four guys putting their heads together and coming up with solutions, oh, it's just the great leader Stalin himself. We showed you this picture before of the Bolsheviks as they're kind of riding the tide of the 1917 revolution. And again, you have Lenin in the lead, you have Trotsky, you have Stalin. But as Stalin begins to take control, begins to alter the story. It's not all those different guys who helped lead the communists to glory. It's just Stalin and Lenin and Trotsky. And you can kind of see he's photoshopped all those people out. And as he has a falling out with Trotsky, who is left to take control? Again, it's just Lenin and Stalin. So working back here, again, we take Stalin begins to take control of the message and literally rewrite the history of who's in charge of the Soviet Union. And then when people go and make him angry and say something he doesn't like or do things he doesn't just kill you. He doesn't just murder you. He doesn't just get rid of your family. He erases you from history, like you see in that picture there. And so that's what the story of the history of the Soviet Union comes into. As Stalin takes control, he works to transform the Soviet Union. Stalin has two major goals. He wants to increase growth in agriculture in the Soviet Union and also increase growth in industrial production. How does he do that? In terms of agriculture, he creates collective farms. These are large government owned farms. So he's taking all the individual different farms of Russia. Think about our classroom with all the 35 different desks in it. Instead of having all 35 different farms all working for their own needs, the Soviet Union comes in and everybody works together, right? And all their crops collectively are gathered together. All the farms are worked together, and all the food is then put in there and then shipped out from there. In terms of industrialization, he creates a series of 5 year plans to direct industrialization. By the end of year five, he wants X amount of coal, X amount of steel. Then he's going to make another year five from this. And we see this. Is this successful? Right? Does the Soviet Union have economic, once it's placed under the government control, does that happen? Is yes. You can say, if you look at it just strictly from the numbers, you can say that by 1937, within 20 years of the communists taking over Russia, the Soviet Union is the world's second largest industrial power. And you can take a guess who's the first? Yes, the United States is, right? And so that is incredibly amazing. How is Russia able to industrialize in the 1920s to the 1930s? It's by these 5 year plans. So on the one hand, it's able to become the largest industrial power, but how does it get there? What's the cost of this? Is millions of lives. Anybody who objects to this, particularly peasants who have been working the same farms for generations in their family, are killed, are sent off to gulags in Siberia and worked to death. And then these collective farms and the new agricultural techniques that don't work, but Stalin fudges and foregoes anyways, causes giant amounts of starvation to where we really don't know the true horrors of the amount of people that were dying because of this. So again, it's kind of this Machiavellian scenario: do the ends justify the means? Does Stalin's ends of the Soviet Union become the second largest industrial power in 1937 justify the means of murdering, killing, imprisoning, starving millions and millions and millions of his own people? And so while outwardly you see these kind of images coming out of the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s of Stalin leading a a giant army, of these collective farms that are raising large amount of foods, of these 5-year plans that are working with the farmers to help industrialize this. What does it come at the cost of? Again, people being imprisoned, sent to Siberia to work in the gulags. All these are pictures, and you kind of get the idea and the numbers of the people who are abducting, being put into chains and forced to work there. And then not only that, masses amount of starvations of where people who around the world kind of slowly learned the horror of this. Stalin wouldn't even allow any of this people to help, as Russians literally died in the streets because they could not eat. And it's there where we're going to end on that lovely note and pick up our story in World War II in our next